Hello, thank you so much for joining us for our second episode of Book Reviews with
Zen Garcia.
and Joy Garcia.
And Joy Garcia.
Yes. We will today be going over Zen's. What book is this actually?
This is the fourth one.
The fourth book.
Lucifer, Father of Cain.
Lucifer, Father of Cain. And we'll just be getting an overview and I'll ask a couple of questions. So Zen, can you tell us a little bit about your book, Lucifer,
Yes.
Father of Cain?
Well, for those that have followed my work, you know that the first three books that I wrote were poetry books, and they were about my journeys and living in a van and crossing across America, living in different national parks, and just my observation and things that I wrote in flowery metaphor about life and living and seeking the divine. Well, this was my first book where I actually wrote about things that I had gleaned from re-examining and studying the ancient manuscripts and a lot of the extra biblical texts. This one's called Lucifer, Father of Cain, and it was the one that got me into trouble with a lot of the alternative truth broadcasters and media hosts. I had no idea that this subject would be so taboo, and so writing about it and presenting it because it was a premise that kept presenting itself to me over and over throughout reading all of the different collections and in revisiting the King James Version of the Bible. And I understood then that what was being described as an apple in the narrative of the fall of humanity and Eve's eating fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that passage was actually conveying metaphorically that there was a sexual connotation associated to her beguilement by the serpent. And then looking at the punishments found in Genesis 3:15, 16, and 17, I realized that God, because consequentially their actions led to, there would be enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. Eve would now have to bear forth children in sorrow, and Adam would have to work the ground in order to bring forth sustenance to feed what would be his future progeny. So all of those things did not make sense to me with regard to the regular Sunday school sermon that she ate an apple, and that whatever reason her eating this apple and Adam's also eating this apple caused them to be banished from paradise and cast down here to the earth where the other fallen angels had already been cast down. And so also looking at in deeper introspection the words that are associated in the Hebrew text for the description of, for instance, the seed and the fruit, perier, and the seed, zera. These Hebrew words are linked also in connotation to children, progeny, descendants. Even the 1 John chapter 3 verse 12, where it says Cain, who was of that wicked one, that word of there, it also implies son of, child of, or progeny of the wicked one. And so those kind of things are, even though they're contained within the scriptures and especially brought forth by Christ in Matthew 13 with the parable of the kingdom, where he tells us about the wheat and the tares, and how the tares came forth when the blade was sprung, meaning when the children were born. And then the angels asked him, do you want us to gather the tares? And he said, no, unless doing that you gather up the wheat also. Let both grow together until the time of the end. And at the time of the end, he would come forth and send the angels forth as reapers to gather, separate the harvest, gather the wheat for preservation and the tares for condemnation. And so these themes are interwoven all throughout the scriptures, but because they are literally understood, people are not able to make sense of so much of what is veiled within even in the King James account, that is connected to this particular premise. And so I brought forth in this book, which was my fourth book, and I actually published it on my son's birthday in 2010, and it was in April 2010. And then when I began to ask people to conduct an interview with me, then I began to realize how taboo this subject was and how many people hated it for whatever reason. And that still does not make sense to me, because when you examine the world and look at what we are contending with, that the war in heaven and also the enmity that begins in the Garden of Eden, it continues till the Battle of Armageddon, and that we see that the forces of evil, the wickedness in high places, they are and connected to the children of Cain. And Christ even said of the Pharisees that ye are of your father the devil, and that their bloodline, their lineage, were actually the murderers of the prophets, all the way from Abel to Zacharias. And Abel was, of course, murdered by Cain, his half-brother, and then Zacharias, the father of John the Baptist, he was the high priest that was murdered in the Holy of Holies during the life of Christ. And so we see that undeniably he is connecting them to being connected to the bloodline of Cain. And so all of these themes are brought forth in this particular book. And because a lot of you are not familiar with this particular book, it seems like a long time ago that it's been written, we want to provide a really deep discount for you to gain access to it, and also to buy numerous copies and to share them with others and to pass them out. I do want to forewarn you, however, that this book was written prior to my coming to discernment on biblical cosmology. And so that's the only thing to be weary of. But with regard to the giants, the fallen angels, the origins of evil, this book lays it all out with regard to all of those connections, and how the bloodlines of the fallen angels are also connected to the children of Cain.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. Just out of curiosity, you were mentioning that a lot of people were just so against it and you had no idea why. Do you remember a couple of the comments that you were receiving when you were feeling that lashback of just why they were so against it?
Well, actually, several people, instead of commenting back, they did shows where they brought on so-called experts to debunk this particular premise. In fact, Dr. Stan Monteith and Tex Mars and several other people, they brought on hosts to refute this as premise and as possibility, and never even replied back to me. Yeah, didn't invite me or ask me to join the conversation, but they just wanted to, immediately try to debunk and to go against and oppose it. And so that happened, and it still happens now.
Sure.
A lot of people will not invite me or associate with me because of my teaching on this subject.
Well, definitely anything that's not mainstream truth, I think, is always going to be received harshly just because of cognitive dissonance at first.
Yes, absolutely.
And so we definitely are so appreciative of you guys for joining us and just being able to be part of our family as we are growing this community of people who are encouraging one another to research truths no matter how harshly we'll feel the lashback, because I mean, even though it feels so lone, we are here with you. So we thank you so much for joining us, and if you do have a book that you have been curious about and you would like for us to review, please feel free to email us and let us know at sacredwordpublishingllc@gmail.com. And thank you so much again for joining us. And this has been Zen Garcia and Joy Garcia, and we'll see you next month. Thank you.
God bless all.